Hello and welcome to this video of games representing queerness. How can queer representation in video games be improved? Now let's dig right into it. As of August last year, a survey from DFC Intelligence shows that there are over 3 billion video game consumers around the globe now. Since the world's population is around 8 billion people, that would mean almost 40% of the whole population are playing video games. Now let that sink in for a while and think about what kind of importance this medium has grown to by now and what influence it might have on us humans worldwide. Video games are an expressive medium. They represent how real and imagined systems work and invite players to interact with those systems and form judgments about them. As part of the ongoing process of understanding this medium and pushing it further, as players, developers and critics, we must understand how to construct and critique the representation in our world in video game form. Thankfully, in the past decades and through globalization, politics and our societies in general are changing towards a more open-minded, diverse and inclusive direction. And with that, our demands on entertainment products as well. Over the last half decade, we have seen this revolutionary work taking place in areas of game making, game community organizing and game scholarship. Dozens, if not hundreds, of LGBTQ+ independent developers are creating games about, by and for queer people. But is that really enough? There are a few questions crossing my mind when critically thinking about games representing queerness. How is queerness represented? Is it represented in a correct and positive way? Why, as in, for which purpose is queerness represented? Are the publishers, developers trying to be inclusive and empathic, or are they just trying to get particular attention, may it be positive or negative, with having, for example, a trans character in their game? And last but not least, how can we improve queer representation in video games? To maybe answer those questions, let's start by looking into how queerness was represented in video games until now. Let's take a look into some positive but also some negative examples of it. Starting with the worst examples of representation, LGBTQ+ characters are often portrayed wrong. By that I don't mean classical stereotypes, which is already stupid enough, but how queer characters often are even designed to be villains or some type of ridiculous joke. In Rockstar's Grand Theft Auto, for example, they featured those transgender characters that were subject of much derision and stereotyping. Or Final Fight's developers Capcom, who felt that players would feel bad beating up a woman, so their solution was to design her as a transgender character, Poison, which is just so wrong on so many levels I can't even express. In general, trans characters or gay characters often were displayed in incredibly bad and homophobic ways. May it be by giving them totally insane and disgusting personalities like Trevor in GTA 5, or even worse by displaying them directly as sex offenders as Atlas did in Persona 5, with the only 2 queer characters in-game. Another issue is that LGBTQ+ representation in video games often is hidden by the developers. Taking The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt for example, there's a short quest where the player is accompanied by a hunter, but only if the player selects the correct series of questions it is revealed that the hunter is gay. So one can say that another huge problem of queer representation in games is that if a queer character is part of a game, it's usually only minor or non-playable characters who are queer. The next important question is, if games feature queer stories and characters, what are the intentions of the developers? Do they want to create a diverse game for the sake of making a positive impact on their players, or is it a marketing strategy only? Now we're seeing so much change and development. There's a huge movement where people are identifying where the stories are lacking or wrong or offensive and addressing those issues. Over the last decade, there has been a growing force for progression and better representation. But there's also been an old school defensiveness pushing back. That's created a huge amount of conflict. Even though queer representation has been improving the last years, there are still issues with most of the representation. Gay or trans characters, for example, often are written completely flat, don't have any other content or personality traits except for being queer. Another thing developers love to use is queerbaiting, which is basically touting inclusion of queerness in order to market a game to a queer audience and getting applause for being diverse and inclusive, while not really implementing it into the game. One perfect example for this would be Tracer from Blizzard's Overwatch. Tracer may be the poster child for Blizzard's massive success, but the fact she's a lesbian is left to a small online comic, with no mention of her sexuality making it into the game itself. The good news is, it's not completely hopeless. There are already at least some positive examples of queer representation.
They are real men, just like you are.
Although most of the good representation can be found in smaller indie games, such as Gone Home, developed and published by the Fulbright Company, which is a story-driven game about exploring and finding out about Sam, who loved a girl named Lonnie. The game is actually filled with real stories from Emily Carroll and her wife, Kate Craig, who had both grown up queer in the 90s and also worked on the environment and illustrations for the game. Or Night in the Woods, another small but popular indie title, developed by Infinite Fall. A lot of characters in the game are queer, relatable and authentic. May, the protagonist that the player follows in-game, is pansexual, two of her best friends, Angus and Greg, are gay or bisexual, Jackie the goat is a transgender woman, and Bombshell is a gay woman. But just the representation of many queer characters isn't the main reason why it's a good representation. It's the way it is represented. With May's sexuality brought up so infrequently, there isn't much more to share. For me, this was actually a positive aspect. It's rarely brought up simply because it's rarely relevant. When May does share this part of herself, it feels natural. She isn't just blurting it out unprompted. This is something I can identify with, being a pan woman myself. I rarely flat out say I'm pan. Your sexuality isn't typically something you shout at people upon meeting. And even AAA titles seem to slowly get better at doing valuable representation of queerness in games, as we can see in The Last of Us 2, where the main character Ellie was shown as queer. To have such a great and well-known character as Ellie in one of Sony's biggest titles be a lesbian felt like a momentous moment. One last important topic I wanted to briefly mention are the role-playing games, where you can customize and design your own character. In most of the games, no matter which genre, you will get an awesome selection of two genders, male and female. Together with stereotypical and also for women, by the way, often super sexualized clothing or armor, while this can be really annoying for cisgendered people, it's often not only annoying, but extremely restricting and marginalizing for genderqueer people, not being able to really express themselves, not even in a video game. At least some role-playing games have been thinking and improving this particular issue in a decent way by now. One very recent game that's a great example is Nintendo's Animal Crossing New Horizon. At least in the English version, the players never have to choose a gender. There are no restrictions regarding hair or facial options, no clothing. The player can choose between all customization options in-game, completely regardless of any gender roles. By utilizing a singular character model for all human villagers, every interaction with the NPC animal villagers is also decidedly ungendered. The NPCs are referring to the player character as well as other NPC villagers with gender-neutral pronouns at all times. The game allows player interactions with all aspects of the game at all times, and no gender has any particular advantage or disadvantage when playing through the game. Now to jump back to my question in the beginning, how can we improve queer representation in video games and sum this all up? We need A, more queer representation in video games because there simply is not enough yet. B, we need authentic and qualitative representation either created by or at least together with queer people. And C, we need to stop using queerness as some kind of joke, stop serving stereotypes, stop queer baiting, and stop with the goddamn discrimination. And finally start creating something beautiful, something real, inclusive and diverse, with authenticity and interesting stories and characters instead. Thank you for your attention.